Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. A special thank you to members of the law enforcement communities and their families and supporters for joining Senator Sessions and myself as we address how we can be doing more to protect the men and women who protect all of us. And I think it bears reminder that law enforcement is always a dangerous job. Since January 1st of this year, 147 law enforcement officers across America have been shot or killed in the line of duty. And it's men and women like Philadelphia police officer Robert Wilson III. Officer Wilson stopped by a game shop to buy a toy for his 9-year-old son. And while he was in the store in Philadelphia, 2 armed robbers burst in, began to open fire. And what Officer Wilson did was he didn't hesitate. He was shot. He continued to fight. He continued to draw fire to himself and away from the other people in the store until a fatal shot was fired that took his life. And recently, of course, we've seen a very, very disturbing trend. It's a trend in which cold-blooded killers are attacking law enforcement simply because they're law enforcement, because they're members of the law enforcement community. Last year, 2 Pennsylvania state troopers were targeted. The killer had only one goal: to kill a police officer. Corporal Brian Dixon was murdered. Trooper Alex Douglas was grievously wounded. And since then, we have seen attacks across America, in New York City, in Trigg County, Kentucky, in Harris County, Texas, Las Vegas, Nevada, and all of these attacks just because there's someone wearing a blue uniform. And what's particularly outrageous is, as these attacks are taking place, what do we hear? What do law enforcement officers see and hear? They hear protesters calling for the murder of cops. They see rioters hurling cement blocks and stones and bricks and glass bottles at police officers. And they hear political opportunists who stand up and sometimes malign the law enforcement officers as though the law enforcement officers are the problem, as though they're racist and bigoted and institutionally biased. The fact is, most Americans know better. Most Americans know that the men and women who put on the uniform every day to protect us, all they want to do is serve their community. They want to protect the people that they've agreed to protect. They don't have a racist bone in their body. And that is the description of the vast, overwhelming majority of our police. So the men and women of law enforcement, I think they deserve to know that America stands by them. And yes, police lives matter. That's why Senator Sessions and I have introduced this legislation. It's called the Thin Blue Act, and it sends a very clear message. If you murder or target a law enforcement officer or a first responder, you should expect a very harsh penalty. Now, in federal court, a jury has to consider certain mitigating and aggravating factors before imposing the death penalty, and these factors are listed in statute. Under our legislation, the Thin Blue Line Act, under current law, if a murder victim was a federal law enforcement officer or prosecutor, then that fact constitutes an aggravating factor. That's existing law. Under our legislation, we would extend that protection to local law enforcement and first responders. The bill also holds that where a defendant targeted a law enforcement officer, a prosecutor, a firefighter, or other first responder, then that targeting constitutes an aggravating factor as well. So Congress has long recognized that an additional deterrence in the form of a harsher penalty is appropriate to protect law enforcement from violence. And there's a simple reason for this, and that is that law enforcement officers and prosecutors and first responders are sometimes particularly tempting targets. Criminals seeking retribution, sometimes gangs and organized crime trying to discourage and intimidate law enforcement into not prosecuting, not enforcing the law against them. We know that that's a reality, and so it is fitting and it's appropriate to have this disincentive in place. Fact is, every day, 780,000 Americans put on a blue uniform, and they answer the call when one of us calls because we're in danger. They rush to danger. They stand and protect us during our darkest moments. it's time that they understand that Congress is going to stand with them. And we'll do that by enacting the Thin Blue Line Act. Let me introduce my colleague and good friend, Senator Jeff Sessions. He's represented the people of Alabama for 18 years, served as a prosecutor for 14 years in the as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Alabama, as Attorney General for Alabama. And of course, in that capacity, he's developed unique insights into the role that prosecutors play in particular, but law enforcement in general. So, Senator Sessions, thank you so much for your support. And
thank you, Pat.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Pat.